I would now like to introduce Erin Tansey, the Director of the Sustainable and Inclusive Economies Division at the International Development Research Centre of Canada. IDRC has generously supported the research of WIEGO and our partners and is co-hosting this event with us today. Erin, thank you, and over to you.
Hi, and thanks so much. Bonjour, hola, namaste. Thanks, and thanks for everyone for joining us on this really great occasion. So really welcome to you all. So I'm based in Ottawa, which is in Canada, and our office is situated on the traditional and unceded territory of the Algonquin and Anishinaabe people. So IDRC is really pleased to be participating and partnering with WIEGO on this important and timely work. Some of you may have already participated in an event that we had in July, where we shared insights from the first wave of data on how the COVID-19 pandemic has been impacting informal workers. So the webinar today is a follow-up to that July discussion. So, before we delve into all of that in the report and some of the findings, I'd just like to say a few words about IDRC, the International Development Research Centre, and our broader work on the COVID-19 response, within which this research today is sort of nested. So IDRC is supporting timely, contextualized, and robust evidence to support the COVID recovery, mainly in low and middle income countries. And one of our flagship initiatives is the COVID-19 Response for Equity, otherwise known as CORE, the CORE initiative. And it's a 3-year, $25 million rapid response initiative that we put in place last year. And the goal is to support high quality, innovative research to inform equitable responses to the COVID-19 crisis, particularly those that target and engage women and marginalized groups to shape and benefit from effective response and recovery efforts. So we mobilize our established networks of research institutions and think tanks in developing regions to fill the urgent need for policy innovations as countries grappled with the economic fallout of a global shutdown and the eroding social cohesion. So we're funding research actually in 42 countries under this initiative. And these are generating data and evidence and are contributing really to a better understanding of the social and economic impacts of the pandemic. We've all know a lot about the health impacts, but the social and economic impacts are possibly even far worse. So they're also informing actions to build more resilient and inclusive economies. And the research findings that we'll hear about today are part of that initiative and focus on how the pandemic is impacting informal workers and the kind of measures that really need to be put in place to ensure that no one is left behind. Why is this work important? I'm sure I'm speaking to the converted in this discussion, but just to remind us all that some 2 billion workers globally are actually in informal employment. And in developing countries, this accounts for 90% of workers. 90% of workers are informal workers. And they've been hit the hardest. We know that by the economic downturn and the fallout of the pandemic. And so more than 18 months since the onset of the pandemic, 600, 700 days, the impact on workers across sectors, across occupations, across regions, really continues, but it also continues to vary and vary greatly. And so does the pace of recovery. So with funding from IDRC as part of this core initiative, WIEGO has collected data from 12 cities across the world on how the pandemic is affecting different categories of workers. So we've got home-based workers, domestic workers, street vendors, and market traders, and waste pickers, and the gendered nature of that. How do women and men fare differently in all of this? So we shared insights from the first round of data collected in July, as I mentioned, and the research team has recently completed a second round of data collection, which is the focus of the webinar today. And so I'm pleased to announce the release of the resulting summary report and of the policy insights in that report. And we'll be posting the link, if it's not in there already, to that report. And the report will also be available on the IDRC websites and also on the WIEGO websites. So the webinar today will share insights from this new data and will specifically highlight how different sectors of informal workers are faring in 2021, what the pace of recovery looks like based on workers' occupation and workers' gender, and what national and municipal governments are doing and they're doing right now, and what they're doing wrong to support the economic recovery in the informal sector. And also, we're going to look at what governments can do to avoid this great divergence in recovery for the majority of the world's workers. So we have with us today some fantastic people on our panel. We've got Mike Rogan, who's the research lead of this study at WIEGO. We've got Sally Roever, she's WIEGO's international coordinator. We have Shalini Sinha, who's WIEGO's India country representative and the leader of the research for the Delhi focal city. And we also are absolutely privileged to have with us 4 speakers from worker-led organizations representing informal workers. So we've got Shalu Ben. She's from the home-based workers. She is a home-based worker and she's based in Delhi in India. We've got Johnson Doe. He's a representative from Pune, which is the Landfill Pickers Association in Accra, Ghana. We have Josefa Marin, representative from Sure We Can, an organization of waste pickers in New York City. And also Mohammed Atiyah, who's a representative of a membership-based organization of street vendors also in New York City. So Mike will kick us off with a brief overview of the report, and then we'll move to a panel discussion following that to get a view from the ground over 18 months into the pandemic and how informal workers really are doing. And we'll really be able to hear directly from them and to find out what the response has been so far and what's working, what's not working, and where do we go next. So then we'll have time at the end to have a discussion and take some of your questions. And really, I encourage you to put your questions in the chat. Some of the questions that are easier to answer will just be answered in the chat, but others that are a little bit more complex will be answered in the plenary. So with that, I now invite Mike Rogan to give us an overview of the key findings and just to set the stage for the panel discussion. Mike, over to you.
Thank you very much. I was wondering if I could just get an indication of whether you can hear me and see my screen.
Mike,
yes,
we can
both.
hear you and see your screen, yes.
Okay, great news. Thanks. Well, thank you for that kind introduction. My name is Mike Rogan. I work with WIEGO's Urban Policy Program, and I'm based at Rhodes University in South Africa. And I feel very privileged today to present the findings of our second round of research on behalf of quite a large study team. So I'd like to extend a thank you for a study team of roughly 10 people that have been working very hard on this research during what you can imagine is quite a difficult period to be collecting data in cities around the world. I'd like to also say an important thank you to the IDRC for your support and partnership, both with conducting this research and conducting this webinar. It's been a fantastic partnership from our point of view, and we're extremely grateful for the support. So thank you. I'd like to say just a few additional things about the research before I present some of the main findings. In front of you, you should be seeing a map of 11 of the 12 cities around the world. We'll be presenting research from 11 of the 12 cities today. But I think it's also important to indicate that we've got a page on the WIEGO website, which gives a great deal of information about the study, as well as all the various publications and presentations that have come from the study. So if any of this catches your attention and if you'd like to find out more, we'd certainly encourage you to visit the WIEGO websites and to navigate to the study page as we've mentioned, we'll make a link available later on. There are a great deal of resources on that page. This is the second round, as Aaron mentioned, of the study. We've collected data almost in the middle of 2020 and in the middle of 2021. One of the important things about this research is that we've been tracking as much as possible the same workers over this period of time. So we've been tracking workers as they've navigated their way through this pandemic over a year-long period. And as much as possible, we've interviewed the same people in both rounds of the research. Today, I'm going to be presenting some very preliminary findings from the survey portion of the research. But it's also important to note that we conducted both qualitative and quantitative research with our respondents. Some of the findings that I'm presenting today, we're sharing for the first time. We're still in the process of trying to understand them in greater detail, both through the qualitative research and through digging in more detail through the quantitative research. So we might not have all the answers to some of the puzzles that the data show us today. But this is certainly ongoing research, and we'll be posting findings as they come along on our website on this particular page. And the findings that I'm going to be presenting today are also focused largely on the sectors that Erin mentioned in her overview, which are domestic workers, waste pickers, home-based workers, as well as two types of retail workers, street vendors and market traders. In several of the cities, we collected data on other types of informal workers, motorcycle taxi drivers, newspaper vendors, masseuses, and delivery drivers, to name just a few. But today I'll be focusing on the four main sectors and just giving you a broad overview of what we know so far about how these more than 2,000 workers have fared during the pandemic over the past year and a bit. So perhaps to start at an obvious place, one of the more tangible and certainly more measurable impacts of the pandemic has been on the ability of informal workers to actually engage in their livelihoods and work, and consequently the impact on their earnings. So perhaps starting with the former, through the two waves of the data that we've collected so far in 2020 and 2021, we have 4 points in time about which we collected data. If you start on the left-hand side of your screen, we've got a data point from February 2020. And this is the point before the pandemic started, obviously. We then have a data point in April 2020, when many, if not all, of the cities in which we conducted research were experiencing some sort of lockdown or restriction on activities. In some cities, it was quite severe. People weren't allowed to leave their homes. In others, there were just various types of restrictions on the types of activities that could be conducted. We then conducted the research in the middle of 2020. So we have a sense of how livelihoods were impacted just after these lockdowns. And then, of course, we're presenting the data we collected in the middle of 2021. Our sample included workers who were almost exclusively full-time before the pandemic. So if you look at the left of the screen, the average days worked per week was just over 5.5 days per week, which is obviously slightly more than full-time. You then see the drastic impact of the beginning of the pandemic, which we reported in the first round. In April 2020, on average, workers had gone from 5.5 days a week before the pandemic to 1.3. By the middle of 2020, the days of work had recovered to about 3.4 after many of those restrictions, those initial restrictions, had been relaxed. So the key finding from 2021 is there's been a slight further recovery to 4 days a week. To put that in perspective, workers are earning or working about 72% of the time they were working before the pandemic. So if we consider the fact that informal workers, almost by definition, don't earn unless they work, this is far from a full recovery to pre-COVID levels of working conditions. I think another way to to think about this particular slide is, while it's presenting the recovery or the limited recovery of the ability to work compared to pre-COVID times, this unique shape of the data, I think, is quite symbolic of the recovery overall amongst informal workers. Certainly the low point was April 2020, but the recovery after that has been somewhat modest, particularly for workers who very much depend on their ability to work on a daily basis to feed themselves and their families. The difference in the ability to work differed quite substantially across the cities. So this is the same information presented in a slightly different way from the previous slide. For each of the 11 cities that you can see there, the dark orange bars represent the average days worked per week before the pandemic. And the light pink bars denote the most recent data point, the average number of days that workers reported working in the middle of 2021 when we interviewed them most recently. What you can see is that while there is a considerable amount of variation in the days worked in the middle of 2021, by and large, almost all of the cities still reported working considerably fewer days on average than they did before the pandemic. So across the cities, there was certainly a lower ability to work full-time compared to what they were working before the pandemic. At the very far right, I've circled two sort of extreme examples in our data set. The first is Pleven, which is the only city that seems to have reported or experienced a near full-time return to employment. So before COVID arrived, workers in that city were working about 5.5 days per week and are now reporting working about 5.6. So very little difference. And in terms of the days worked, there was a near full recovery in working days in Pleven. Right next to that, to the right, is the opposite extreme. In February 2020, the workers who were exclusively home-based workers in Tirupur were working about 4.5 days per week on average, and are now still working at the last point of data collection, less than 1 day per week. So this is quite an extreme reduction in the ability to work or average working days in Tirupur. But across the rest of the cities, there's still a notable reduction in the ability to work across all of the cities. And as a reminder, in each of these cities, we sampled different sectors of work with just a few exceptions. As such, it also makes sense to look at how earnings were impacted, and particularly by different groups of workers. As Aaron mentioned, this is one of the interests of the study, is to try and understand how workers, different groups of workers have been impacted. Since we know that, that across the sample, the workers have not returned to work to the same extent that they had before the pandemic, it's perhaps not surprising to learn that earnings have been impacted quite severely. So the way we're presenting earnings here is as a share of pre-COVID earnings. And if you look to the very right, where we have the total for the sample, when we last interviewed workers in the middle of 2020, the typical worker in our sample was earning only 35% of what they were earning before the pandemic. So this is obviously quite a sharp reduction in earnings in the middle of 2020. Now in 2021, you can see the gray bar there. The last time we interviewed them, they were earning 64% of what they were earning before the pandemic. And that represents the typical worker in our sample. So if we sort of said that workers were only working 72% of the days they were working before the pandemic, we can see that earnings are even slightly below that. It would suggest that even workers who were back at work aren't earning at the same levels that they were before the pandemic. If you look to the left of the graph there, we've disaggregated these earnings by the four main sector groups that we're talking about today: domestic workers, home-based workers, street vendors and market traders, and as well as waste pickers. So perhaps the first thing you'd notice is that there's quite a bit of variation in terms of the level of earnings compared to pre-COVID levels. So waste pickers in 2020 were earning about 49% of their pre-COVID levels and are now earning about 79% of their pre-COVID levels for earnings. And street vendors slightly less in both periods. The two groups that probably stand out at this particular stage are domestic workers, who were earning about 32% of their pre-COVID earnings levels in the middle of 2020. And then when we interviewed them in the middle of this year, their recovery was considerably higher than the other groups. Their recovery was about 91% of their pre-COVID earnings. We're still unpacking the meaning behind this, but what we have detected so far is there's quite a bit of variation in terms of the domestic workers across the different cities we sampled. And a lot of that will come out both in the qualitative work and in the city level reports that we're producing at the moment and we'll share on the website. But of course, the main finding from this particular graph is the earnings reductions amongst home-based workers. And I'm sure most people are aware that this is a group that's almost exclusively comprised of women workers. They were affected very badly by the disruptions to the supply chains and the inability to work in the middle of 2020. At that stage, we'd reported that they were earning at the median only about 10% of their pre-COVID earnings. So in other words, they'd lost 90% of their earnings in the middle of 2020. One would have hoped desperately that this had improved in the middle of 2021. But a year on from that, we find that home-based workers are earning only 2% of what they were earning before the crisis started. This, it goes without saying, is nothing short of a catastrophe. And I think we'll be talking about this in some detail and picking up some of this nuance later in the panel discussion. But suffice to say that a large part of this is the complete disruption of demand for work orders and the inability of home-based workers to regain any of their previous livelihoods. We know that it's not just the sector of employment that determines the impact of the crisis on your earnings. Obviously, city and country level restrictions play a large part. So if we look at the same sort of earnings comparisons, but zoom out to the city level, we can see that there's a great deal of variation in terms of the recovery of earnings. Here again, the dark orange bar denotes earnings levels in the middle of 2020, and the light pink bars denote earnings levels in the middle of 2021, earlier this year. And again, earnings are presented as the median percentage of earnings as a share of their pre-COVID levels. I've circled again the two extreme examples. So if we look at Pleven and Tirupur, in the middle of 2020, the typical worker in Pleven was earning 70% of what they earned before the crisis, but recovery was almost complete. So by the middle of this year, their earnings were back to their pre-COVID levels, which is what that 100% denotes. There's a bit more to say about that, and we can certainly discuss that in the discussion section. But the other example, the other extreme that stands out is Tirupur. When we interviewed the home-based workers in Tirupur in the middle of 2020, the typical home-based worker was earning 0. And when we've returned in the middle of this year, the story was much the same. So again, this is a deeply concerning finding, but one which we found in different pockets and different sectors across our sample. If we look at the rest of the cities, the story is generally that earnings are slightly higher in the middle of 2020, but not as high as they were before the COVID crisis arrived. There are, however, a couple of exceptions. Durban and Bangkok are two. And if we look at the Bangkok findings there, workers in that city reported that their earnings were 72% of their pre-COVID levels in the middle of 2020, but are actually lower in the middle of 2021. only 39%, so 61% lower than they were pre-COVID. So a deterioration of earnings in cities such as Bangkok and Durban. But overall, the clear finding in relation to earnings is that we're nowhere near, for these groups of workers that we've sampled, their pre-COVID levels of earnings. I think it's important to remind ourselves at this particular point that prior to the pandemic, earnings were low for many of these workers. Many of them were amongst the working poor in the countries in which they live and work, meaning that even before the crisis arrived, they were struggling to meet their basic needs by definition of being below their country's poverty lines. So even small reductions in earnings would be nearly catastrophic for many of these workers and their families. So the fact that earnings across the sample are only 64% of what they were before the pandemic is truly a sobering finding, particularly as we're now arriving on 18 months into this particular crisis. And as we're all very much aware, we've recently been reminded that the crisis is far from over. These drops in earnings and the inability to recover the ability to work and earnings obviously have important implications for food security and demonstrate the strong need for government support. If we think about what these drop in earnings actually mean at the household level, we can consider several measures of food security that we collected in both rounds of data collection. But looking back in the middle of this year, 29% of our respondents indicated that an adult in their household had gone hungry in the month prior to the survey, and 27% of our respondents with children in their household indicated that a child had gone hungry in the month before the survey was conducted. Perhaps even more worryingly, the vast majority, or at least the majority, 57% of our sample indicated that they had skipped a meal or reduced the variety of food they consume in order to cope with the drop in earnings that we just discussed. As we know from the vast public health literature on food security, even short periods of food insecurity or reduced dietary diversity have longer-term development effects, particularly for children, which is a worrying concern, given that it essentially means that these disruptions that we're experiencing now are likely to have longer-term implications for development and most specifically the health and well-being of children and adults in the households of these workers. Given these alarming findings with the reduction in earnings and the impact this has on food security and nutrition, it's obviously important the government plays some role in delivering food security or food relief rather, and cash relief. We'd reported in the middle of 2020 that about 37% of workers had received some type of cash relief in response to the crisis. We noted two things at the time. The first was that this was just over a third of workers, meaning that the majority of workers in our sample were dealing with the crisis without government cash support, but also that when the support was provided, it was nowhere near enough to replace the loss in earnings that workers had experienced. So if we look at the orange bars, this captures the percentage of workers in each city that reported some type of cash relief from government in response to the crisis in 2020. And the pink bars denote the receipt of cash relief in 2021. And if you look to the very right there, you can see that only 2% more of workers in our sample reported receiving relief in 2021. Despite the length and depth of this particular crisis, there's been very little change in the percentage of workers that receive cash support to replace these lost earnings. This increase was driven largely by increases in two cities, Durban, South Africa, and Lima, Peru. And in both of those cities, that's increased to just over 60% of workers in our sample that received cash relief. was explained by the slow rollout of cash relief programs or emergency relief programs in those countries that were initiated earlier, but only gained traction by 2021. But the sobering outcome of this particular graph is that most workers are coping with this loss of earnings and ability to work on their own. And I think that's reflected in the very alarming findings about food insecurity. So I'll conclude with just a few key points, I think, from this preliminary look at the quantitative findings from the second round of our study. The news currently is obviously dominated by this new variant, which has emerged. And in many developed countries, the message seems to be that the pandemic has not gone away. But I think the message and the perspective from workers in the informal economy in the global south is that the pandemic and the crisis has never gone away. As you can see from those findings, irrespective of which metric we use, we're very far away from anything that resembles a recovery. This new variant isn't good news for informal workers either, but it just shows that the crisis has been ongoing for about 18 months now for these particular workers. I think it's important to highlight the impact of the crisis on the livelihoods of home-based workers in particular. Their livelihoods have been decimated with very little relief in sight. You'll hear a bit more about this later in the panel. But this is a sector which has really borne the brunt of the crisis. And as we know, this is a sector that's comprised largely of women informal workers. As I mentioned earlier, most of the workers in the sample would have been identified as working poor in their respective countries. It's therefore not surprising that this impact on work and earnings has coincided with a crisis in food security and hunger. Despite the length and depth of the crisis, government support 18 months into the crisis continues to be both uneven and inadequate. It varies certainly by city and context, but even when workers have received some type of government support in the form of food or cash relief, it's been inadequate to replace their lost earnings. As a result, our initial round of analysis suggests that many workers are going deeper into debt. Many workers are selling assets and dipping into meager savings to mitigate the effects of the crisis. And very few workers, despite government intentions otherwise, have received any type of debt relief or rental relief or loans to restart their businesses. Something like only 7% of workers in our sample across the cities have received any type of government support in the form of a loan to reignite their livelihoods. And then finally, Erin mentioned that 90% of workers in developing countries are informal. Globally, informal workers are the majority of the workforce, 61%. And it just seems really difficult to consider a global recovery if workers in the informal economy, who are the majority of workers globally, are still falling behind and nowhere near their pre-crisis levels in earnings and time in the labor market. And I don't think it's a stretch to suggest that unless we find a way to support the majority of these workers, it doesn't make sense to think about a sustainable recovery going forward. But thanks for your interest. And again, please do visit the WIEGO website. We have a dedicated page, as I mentioned, for this study and the outputs that have come out of it and are continuing to come out of it. We'd be happy to engage with you about this research. I see lots of you are from research institutions and organizations yourselves, so please reach out. We'd be more than happy to talk about our study with you. But for now, just thanks for your interest, and back to the chair.
Thanks, Mike. Goodness me, it's actually very emotional. These findings is just, they're incredibly difficult to hear, although we we have to face this reality, and you're absolutely right. There's no good recovery without 90% of workers in developing countries. You talked about the decline in earnings, which has been so stark, particularly for home-based workers, for whom supply chains have been broken and work has just been broken, and governments aren't capitalizing on the opportunity to invest in sort of a bottom-up recovery. It's a terrible state of affairs. And now I wanted to start sort of the panel discussion after that very, very clear and concise summary of the report findings. And the first person we'll speak with is Shalu Ben. She is a home-based worker based in Delhi. Shalu Ben, namaste.
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 Namaste to all my sisters.
Shalu Ben, about the experience of home-based workers in Delhi and the ongoing challenges to your livelihoods. Why is your sector particularly hard hit?
जी, मेरा नाम शालू है.
Okay, I'm Shalu. I am a home-based worker, and I do sewing, I do embroidery, and I also do hemming. Let me just tell you that when COVID came in 2020, I was in a very dismal state. I faced many problems. There were scores of problems in my life. My husband got unemployed. Then it had a very bad impact on my family. Children had to be educated. There was no money. And there was no employment. I did not have work. My husband was unemployed. It impacted the studies of my children. I had to pay for my house rent. I didn't have money for that. I didn't have money to pay for the fees of my children. And I could not go anywhere. It was so difficult to move from one place to the other. I was facing a very difficult situation at that time. And sisters like me were very badly impacted by COVID. We are all home-based workers. We were facing slew of problems. We got work from the contractors. The contractors were not giving us work. Markets were closed. And then when the second wave of COVID came at that point of time, so many people were dying one after the other. There was so much of fear at that time. We could not go anywhere for work. So from Seva, I gave masks to my sisters. Then provision of a ration was also made by Seva. I helped the sisters to get a ration from Seva. And I behaved like a leader. I played a leadership role, and I tried to give utmost assistance from Seva and from a contract. From the contract also, I gave some work like making of masks. That work I gave to them. Yes, of course, we are getting work, no doubt, but the rates are very low. They are very dismal. If we were getting 1 rupee earlier, now we are getting 50 paisa. Earlier we were getting 10 paisa, now we are getting just 5 paisa. We are laboring so hard nowadays, but not earning enough. Now we are getting such a low amount that it is very difficult to earn our livelihood. We are working so hard, but not getting anything in return. I as well as my sisters are very much troubled due to this corona pandemic, and many of my sisters migrated to the villages because there was no work here. The husbands were unemployed, and what they were doing at home, that work also they were not getting. So they decided to migrate to the villages since there was no work. Now, what I want from the government is that the government should give a thought. We are facing so many problems, so the government should think about our plight. And there are so many sisters like me who are living in such distressful conditions. There is so much of expenditure. Nobody thinks about us. The government should pay attention towards our condition. It's a very sad situation, and the COVID has made a very bad impact on the home-based worker. So I think the government should give a serious thought to us and our condition. We are associated with SEVA. Yes, of course, SEVA is giving us a lot of help, lot of assistance. We have all taken the vaccines, and SEVA has helped us in vaccination. Of course, we got a ration also twice from SEVA. That was a big help to us. I urge upon the government to please help us and make our rates respectful, because we are we are in serious problem because we are not able to earn our livelihood with this meager income. We are just getting pittance. So we should also be identified. We should be respected. We should be dignified. During Corona time, government has helped everyone, but we have not been identified. The government has not given us any kind of assistance. We urge upon the government to please increase our rate and give us help and assistance. This is what we want from the government.
Thank you so much, Shalu. Really are very clear what you've gone through, but also your call to government.
I'm thankful to you. I'm thankful to you, ma'am.
And I hope some in the government are listening to you today as you speak so clearly about the needs of home-based workers in Delhi, but throughout India. And I'm sure that your situation is similar in many, many countries around the world. So thank you so much. I'm going to stay in Delhi now, but turn over to Shalini. Shalini, your research looked at the broader spectrum of informal workers and the implications of the COVID pandemic on their livelihoods. Shalu just gave us incredible insights of the experience of home-based workers and the challenges that they faced. How are other informal workers impacted, and what kind of support do they need from government?
Thank you, Erin, for this opportunity, and also thank you, Shalu for so poignantly presenting the situation of home-based workers. Before I move on to other sectors, just a couple of things. One, I do want to mention that the home-based workers are also very invisible. And even in the sample in Delhi, where we looked at all the 4 sectors in pre-COVID times, they were the lowest earning sector. So, it's been very tough for those for the home-based, and we saw from Mike's presentation also. But that is not to say that it has been recovery is complete or anywhere near close to pre-COVID times for other sectors as well. The story is grim for the informal workers of Delhi, and there are a lot of informal workers. 80% of the workforce in Delhi is informal, and amounting to about 4.92 million informal workers in the city. And these are conservative estimates, and perhaps they would be many more. Overall, for all the sectors, what we see is the earnings and days work continue to be low across all the sectors as compared to pre-COVID times. And therefore, what we are witnessing is a staggered and limited recovery. However, the story of recovery and the pathways to recovery varies across sector, and I'll try to share some of that with you. But before I do that, I do want to remind you all that this year we had the deadly second wave in April, May. And just a few numbers to tell you how bad it was. They were at the peak of the second wave, there were 28,000 cases being reported every day and over 450 deaths on a daily basis. This added to this were lack of medical supplies, lack of hospital beds, lack of oxygen. There was a lockdown which was enforced from April 19 to May 31st. And though anecdotally we know that the lockdown was not so harsh in terms of the restrictions, the workers in their interviews have talked about the restrictions that the curfew in the lockdown imposed on their movement for work, but also the kind of ghettoing in overcrowded and underserviced slums where they live. Coming back to the sectors, the waste picking sectors was one of the sectors. In Delhi, we looked at all the 4 sectors: home-based workers, street vendors, waste pickers, and domestic workers. So I'm going to only talk, Shalu Ben's talked about the home-based workers. I'm going to only talk about the waste pickers and the other 2 sectors. The waste pickers also we saw were working less number of days per week on an average and earning lesser than before the pandemic. And the reasons that came out in the interviews that we did was largely because of access of waste due to restriction imposed by municipalities and resident associations to sort and segregate waste. This manifested itself in several ways. One was that, the space for segregating waste was not made available, which was earlier made available to them. Collection was taken over either by private actors or municipality vehicles, where waste is, not segregated properly. And then there was less quantity and quality of waste at segregation centers where large number of women waste pickers work. In terms of the street vendors, what we saw was that with repeated lockdown and market closures, they had less customers, less income, and increasing need for capital. In Delhi, let me give you an example that there are 500 odd weekly markets which run in Delhi, and they, for the past 2 years, they have more or less not opened. Only in the last 2 months that they have started opening. And our policies opened the malls before they opened the markets. Even the markets which opened at this, we saw that the shops would open, but the vendors would not be allowed to vend. The government did have a policy, a Swanidhi policy, it was called, of a one-time loan, but the slow rollout, initial access, the documentation required initially for access, all of it made it too little, too late. Though with the workers intervening, some things have improved. The domestic workers, which is largely a women's sector, their daily earnings have recovered to a great extent, but monthly earnings have not. Now, just to remind you that in Delhi, we only looked at part-time domestic workers who work in several houses. And the reason could be that there is a fall in average number of houses that they may be working in, and also average number of work days. The domestic workers said that there was a tremendous loss in bargaining power. They could not ask for better wages, better income, better working conditions. And in fact, very recently, a group of domestic workers shared with me what they called a Black Diwali, a Diwali with no lights, no gifts, no new clothes, no sweets, and no bonus from the employer, the Diwali bonus, which is an annual this thing. But there are also 2 very subtle trends that we see in this sector. One is that the appearance of app and web-based platform for some of the services that the domestic workers are providing, but also the men folk coming into this sector to take on some of the work within the domestic work, which has a little more value in terms of the amount of money that you make out of it, such as cooking. So women are confined to cleaning, where the volume of work has increased and the rates have not increased, but perhaps may have decreased a little bit also. Nearly, so this was the sector, but overall, the worker households have experienced distress, and they have talked about loss in income levels, depletion in savings, and many have also talked about how they feel that they may not be able to replace some of the savings that they have used, and are experiencing a significant debt burden. Nearly half the workers reported food insecurity in the form of skipped meals and reduced consumptions. This is despite the fact that many of them had also received food support from NGOs and from the government, but must remember that this comes at a time, this kind of support when in times of stress, lockdowns, etc. So what we see is also that the recovery, when the recovery is inconsistent, I think the informal workers need regular and long-term food support. Rent was also identified as an additional burden, and informal workers have also talked about how where they live, the insecurity of where they live, the constant fear of eviction, and also inability to maintain any kind of safety protocol for COVID in such clusters of people living together. In Delhi, this is also the year when the master plan is being written. And the master plan is a document for planning for the city for the next 20 years. And you must remember that in a country like India, which is so vast, the way that the disease played out and the policy that were and the plans that were used to control the disease were also quite city specific. What was happening in Delhi in the middle of the year was not what was happening in Chennai. So city emerged as an area of, as an actor of impacting the livelihood, because in its policy, in its lockdown, in its how it visualized informal work and informal spaces of work became very important. Secondly, the speciality of work and living of work was also highlighted very tragically during this time. So when this master plan came out, a draft master plan came out, it became an opportunity to work towards concerted steps to make cities more equitable, to work towards an economic recovery for all. And we have been a part of a campaign which is called Main Bhi Delhi campaign, which means, translated into English, I too am Delhi. And it is a campaign which consists of about 40 civil society organizations, activists, academics, and urban planners. And the idea is to plan a city which is just and which is worker friendly. The pillars of the campaign are 3: livelihood, largely informal livelihood, housing, and gender. And much of the work in the past has been done to facilitate workers' participation in planning a city which reflects their needs and their work that they do. And so I want to just end by saying that in Delhi, we feel that the future must provide just and equitable lives for all its citizens. And our efforts that we are doing with the master plan seems like an opportunity to build back better. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Shalini. Really wonderful insights there. And the complexity of all of this is it's hard to believe that our governments are not taking even some of the smallest measures to assist the largest number of people in the cities. Let's now turn away from Delhi and move over to Africa and hear about the situation playing out in Accra in Ghana. Johnson, you represent landfill waste pickers in Accra. So we'd like to hear, the audience I'm sure would like to hear about how the pandemic has impacted your work and those of people that you work with, and how are people coping?
Well, thank you very much for this great opportunity. And I'll start. The Landfill Waste Pickers Association is a membership-based organization of informal pickers working on the landfill site in Accra. So we have been working on the landfill for over 30 years, but some of us have worked as waste pickers much longer. And in terms of numbers, we are now over 500 waste pickers working at the landfill site. what we do is to collect, sort, and sell different types of recyclable materials for our livelihoods, such as plastics, paper, metals, and e-waste, etc. A lot that you can mention. We mainly work, we make mainly our living through collecting and selling of valuable recyclable materials from the landfill. Food needs, education of children, and supporting our families are some of the key things that we work with. Yet we are faced with some threats to our livelihoods. Despite the importance of our work for our livelihoods, the environment, and the country, we are still faced with many problems. With the onset of COVID-19, our access to recyclable materials has been difficult. Now, the volumes, quality, and prices of the materials we collect have reduced so much. This has resulted in a reduction of incomes, reduction of our incomes. For example, before plastic, a kilo of plastic is getting to 3 cedis per kilo, but now it has reduced to 1.2 cedis per kilo, which is really affecting the income of the waste pickers. Another big threat is the ongoing closure of the landfill site without any safeguard measures for waste pickers. There are a lot of discussions going around the landfill or the dumps currently we are working. There is no engagement with the waste pickers at the landfill site. Also, there is nothing like consulting the waste pickers or planning, thinking of them how to provide them some measures, safeguard measures for their livelihoods, which is also one of the biggest threats the landfill waste pickers are facing in Accra. And the plans to introduce waste to energy in the country will also affect us, such as such projects divert waste from the landfill site to the incineration plant, which is also a livelihood threat to the waste pickers in Accra. We see these actions as a threat because we will no more get access to the waste as we normally do on our daily basis. And this will affect our livelihood seriously in future. Waste pickers have been undertaking various steps to reduce the impact of COVID-19 and on us and the threats that we face. Like with the support of WIEGO, we have begun exploring livelihood opportunities outside the landfill site. We were trying to build a model or alternative livelihood model in case the landfill is not there or the landfill is closed. In future, we can have something to do, which we undertake a 2 pilot collection in the coastal community. We have developed a proposal out of the results that came out of the pilot collection to advocate for a secure contract from the local government for a doorstep waste collection in the coastal community, which is also to improve sanitation and also to create green jobs for ourselves in future. Another thing we are also doing at our level, we are currently also in the process of building a waste picker cooperatives that will be the vehicle through which the doorstep contract will be implemented. Learning from other countries and other departments, we see that when we are into cooperative, it will help us move faster than being in an association. We also advocate for recognition and support for waste pickers in Ghana, considering the importance and risks associated with our work. It's good that the government or the local government recognize the work that we do at this early stage, or in terms of the threats that we face at the dump sites, even in the community or the society, the stigma and others, we advocate for recognition for the support of waste pickers. Through our association, we in our own way have been extending support to the most vulnerable one among us, such as the elderly, those with medical conditions, and injury waste pickers, which in our own level, we are trying to provide some social support to them, although it will not be enough, but it's good we started working together or uniting them in terms of this, providing this support with also the issues related to COVID. We also make sure our members were well informed about the COVID protocols, the trainings, and other safety measures that we need to adopt as an association or as a group of people to work with. So with the interest of time, I will thank you for the opportunity. Thank you once again.
Thank you, Johnson. I mean, you're saying some of the things that Shalu Ben was saying as well. I mean, you're asking for respect and human dignity in the daily work that you do, and recognition for the work that you do and the contribution that you're making to your communities. So thank you so much. That was very, very insightful. I'm going to turn now to Josefa, who's in the United States. So in contrast to your counterparts in Accra and other places, what do canners in New York need and demand?
Well, first of all, as you all know, I'm Josefa Marin, and I've been a waste speaker for more than 10 years. And what can I tell you? I spent a lot of hours recycling so that I can have earnings, and I am here in a recycling center, which is very important for me and for all of the recyclers in the area. And this means a lot to us, and this is sure we can. And this is a place where we can have, or where we can conduct our activities. We are paid more than other centers here. We receive more than 5 cents. And what can I tell you? We are asking for more cans and bottles to be recycled because many people do not bring the recyclables here, and we want more. We need more, and also we need more than these 5 cents. I mean, there are many juice bottles that are not brought here, and we wish for them to be brought here in the future so that we can sell them here in New York. And what we are also asking is for the price to be increased up to 10 cents because everything has increased. Education, classes, basic supplies from the supermarket. Money is not enough. We need more. And this crisis has been too much for recyclers because we need to put a lot of effort, and we are trying to do our best so that we can have our earnings, so that we can go through the day. And if someone is listening to us, we would like for our income to be increased at least up to 10 cents, because this would be huge for us, because what we would recycle in the past is not enough now. So we need to be paid more because it's many of us who depend on this. It's not only me. There are lots of people. We In New York are more than 10,000 people recycling. They are not here at Sure We Can, but they do go to other centers. So I would like for these 5 cents to be taken to 10 cents and for us to receive more bottles and cans to be recycled. And as I said, here in Sure We Can, during the pandemic, they have helped us a lot and we cannot complain about that, because here at Sure We Can, we've been given support, we've been given masks to protect ourselves, we've been given gloves and everything related to the protection against the pandemic. And for us, this has been a great support to be given all of that to be safe. Of course, not 100% safe, but we know that we must be careful. And during the pandemic and during lockdown here, we were able to go through the day with our savings, because unluckily, since there was a lockdown, we couldn't go out and sell our stuff. Now we are trying to be more and more active, and now with the current scenario, we are going through a lot because many prices are going up, like the gas, supermarket supplies, and all of these increases in prices are truly affecting us, recyclers. And we are very important, and we hope for the government to realize this, that we are important workers for them, because we are helping the economy first. And secondly, we are cleaning the streets. We are collecting the garbage, as they call it. So we hope that they can acknowledge us and recognize us, and they should see how we are discriminated against for what we do out in the streets. And people should not be doing that. They should show solidarity towards us, because we are collecting what they call garbage, because it's garbage for them, but it's our work for us. So what else can I say? It will be very important for us to receive higher payments and for our work to be acknowledged. As I said, we need what we do to be increased up to 10 cents. And I mean, I don't know what else to say, but all of these issues are very important to us, because we are also helping the environment. And all of these materials that we are collecting, that we are picking, they are not going out to the ocean, they are staying here with us. Because let's bear in mind that many of these are going to the oceans through the sewing systems. And all the fish and sea animals are suffering because of all this waste that is heading there. I watch documentaries and I see that the beaches are full of garbage too. And we as recyclers and waste pickers can do a lot by collecting all this waste. So why cannot they see us as workers too? That's it. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you so much, Josefa. Really, I mean, you are essential workers. And the word that struck me in what you've just said is solidarity. That's what you're asking for, solidarity. Solidarity from the people that live in your city for the work that you do. And your message was very clear. So thank you so much for that. So now I wanted to just bring in Mohammed, and he represents street vendors in New York. Mohammed, can you tell us about how you're supporting members and advocating for supportive policies during this period?
Sure. Thank you so much, Erin, for having me. And thanks everyone for the great work that you're all doing. And thanks for this amazing event. it's really heartbreaking to hear from everyone, especially Shalu. I really want to thank her so much for sharing with us here the story that she is struggling with during COVID, which resonates a lot with us, resonates a lot with me, with what I'm hearing from my members every day. And what we are hearing in the street vendor scene in New York City is exactly what every informal worker is struggling with across the globe. The same situation, the same discrimination, the same hardships, the same challenges that people have been dealing with. And what we are asking for is pretty much the same, like recognition of the hard work we do, recognition of the contribution to the economy, to running our cities, to running our countries, and also the support that everyone has been lacking. And it is pretty much the same here. Like a lot of people might think that New York City would probably be in a good shape. It's one of the richest cities in the world, and nobody in here will go hungry. But COVID have shed the light that this is not true. COVID have shed the light that we have a broken system, that we have at least 2 cities within New York City, probably more. We have a city for the rich people and a city for the people who cannot put food on the table, who are struggling to work every day to just feed themselves and their families. Looking at what happened during COVID and how people were impacted significantly, and how most vendors lost their income completely. And now, even a year and a half after the pandemic hit the city, we have seen that now not everyone has recovered. A lot of people haven't recovered yet. A lot of people are still reporting a huge loss in their income. And a lot of what we do is now talking about how the whole system needs to be reformed. It is not a COVID issue anymore. COVID only shed the light on the challenges that people have been dealing with, the injustice that exists within the system. But we have learned that street vendors have been living in crisis here for so long. It is not a new thing. It is not a thing that COVID created. For decades, street vendors in New York City have been dealing with an inequitable system, a system that criminalized them, a system that put them in handcuffs and jails for doing the work they do, a system that exclude them from any support. And we have seen that during COVID. We have seen that once COVID hit the city, a lot of people went broke. A lot of people didn't have any safety net to rely on. All these programs that the government provides, street vendors didn't benefit from them. People didn't have enough savings to rely on. People were even relying on their friends and family members and even relatives across the globe, out of the country. People were reaching out to their families in Mexico and Egypt and different places and asking for help, asking for loans to make sure they put some food on the table and survive this pandemic. Our work has been all about organizing the community and make sure that their voices are heard, and make sure that the policies are changing in the right direction. Make sure the system is being reformed, make sure people are not being criminalized. For folks who are not aware of the vending system in New York City, the city placed a cap on the number of permits and licenses back in the 70s and 80s. And that created a system in place where a lot of vendors are being criminalized for the work they do. And we have been working very hard on a campaign for the last 7 years, pushing the government to lift those caps, to make sure that this industry is being legalized and formalized, and make sure that people are getting the right license and permit they need to operate their business. Finally, we had a major victory earlier this year in January. The city council here in New York City passed a legislation that will increase the number of food vending permits available by 4,000 new permits over the next 10 years, which we believe is great, and it's something historic. It hasn't happened over the last 39 years. Now we're looking forward to work with the state government to actually push a legislation to lift the caps entirely, to legalize all street vendors, to make sure everyone can get the right license and permits. All of this, along with make sure that the recovery in the city, in the state, in this nation, is an inclusive recovery. We have been so tired and so sick of being exclusive. We have been exclusive in every single level. We look at what this country have spent on putting small businesses back to work, flooding a lot of money, millions and billions of dollars into the economy. And we have seen that street vendors couldn't benefit from that for many, many reasons. And the main one was the lack of documentation. People cannot prove the ownership of their business. People run their business in a very traditional way that they don't have the required documentation that the government requires. And despite the fact that they have put all this money, all these millions and billions of dollars for small businesses to recover and workers to recover, we have seen that street vendors were excluded from that. We have partnered in solidarity with a lot of other informal workers, a lot of immigrant-based organizations across the state to demand a fund for the excluded workers who are immigrants, who are undocumented, who didn't receive a penny from the government, not even those lame $1,200 checks that came once in 2020. And we ended up winning. And again, the state created the first of its kind, a $2.1 billion fund to fund the excluded workers, to make sure the excluded workers get the funds they need and deserve. However, this fund ran out in the first 2 months. And now we are in the process again to push again with the state government to make sure that they increase the fund and make more funds available to make sure no one is being excluded and everyone can recover. I saw like how what we are doing here is so aligned with a lot of people across the globe. I saw like the fact that people are pushing for the same demands, and that's what we are asking for from our local governments, national governments across the globe. People need to listen that informal workers should not be excluded anymore. They run the city, they run the economy, they run the nation, and we cannot keep them excluded anymore. And thank you all for having me here.
Thank you, Mohammed, and congratulations. Those are two massive victories. That's really, really inspiring, and I'm sure it's inspiring many people that are on this call. It's excellent news, and I know obviously there's lots more work to do, but small victories lead to bigger ones. So really, that's thanks for sharing that with us. I'm now going to ask a question to Sally. Sally, we were able to hear about these three cities, Delhi and Accra and New York, out of the 12 that you have, that you've done the research on. But I wanted us to zoom out a little bit again and kind of get the broader picture again. So in your view, why is recovery for informal workers not happening in the way that we would hope? And what are the opportunities that countries should seize in the economic and the recovery planning?
Okay, thanks so much, Erin. It's a great privilege to be here, and thanks for your question. So I think zooming out from the experiences and perspectives we've heard from Shalu in Delhi and Johnson in Accra and Josefa and Mohammed in New York, that those experiences reflect, broadly speaking, what is happening in the global employment structure and in approaches to economic recovery that's driven by government. So let's think about each one of those two pieces. The first one is what is happening in the global employment structure, and what we're seeing is that the structure is one in which more and more people who work are working under informal employment arrangements, whether it's sort of the old type of informal employment arrangements or the new type of informal employment arrangements. And I think it's worth dwelling here for just a second on this idea of how employment is arranged, because it came up in the chat, one of the questions as well, which is, so like who are we talking about when we're talking about informal workers? Who counts? Is a micro entrepreneur an informal worker? So what's important here, I think, is to think about, everyone who works is a worker, and every worker is in an employment arrangement. And that arrangement can be either an informal employment arrangement or a formal employment arrangement. So the question is like, how is it arranged? So informal employment arrangements are the norm, and employers are getting more creative about ways to arrange employment so that it is informal, because that's a way of pushing the risk down to workers, as Shalu, for example, shared. Governments as well have ways of making an informal employment arrangement, or making an arrangement informal, so not recognizing the person who's doing the work as a worker is a way of creating an employment arrangement that's informal. So that's what we're talking about here. It's also, as we learned, the norm that during COVID, that workers in informal employment arrangements are most severely affected by everything, by the virus, by the lockdowns, by the disruptions in supply chains, and so on. Why is that the case? Because those arrangements don't offer any protections against really any aspects of the crisis. So the road to recovery for them is longer. Without protections and without access to relief, they've had to draw down savings and sell off assets and reduce their food intake in order to survive for these 2 years. And that's, I think, really important when we think about those bar graphs that Mike showed at the beginning, where even though there's some recovery in earnings, when the earnings went down so severely, like I think Mohammed mentioned, and in the bar chart, the New York one went down to like 6% or something. So when that happens, what workers have to do is draw down their savings, sell off their assets in order to get through. So it's not only that earnings haven't recovered, it's that what they had behind the earnings in the way of assets they've also lost. So that's where we are. And I think it's probably, as we're thinking about, again, kind of the global scenario, it's probably also worth mentioning that the norm that we see in our network is that workers and worker-powered organizations are doing what they can. They're doing their part against great odds. They're finding ways to survive. There are ways to mobilize relief, ways to facilitate access to programs where they exist, and so on. So then what's happening then with the second piece, which is the government approaches to recovery. So we've kind of looked at the global policy landscape, and then we've also closely analyzed a handful of countries in their recovery approaches. And what we find is that although the majority of workers are in these informal employment arrangements, recovery approaches themselves, recovery plans, make no mention of them at all. So even though investing in these workers who are worst off, who have been hit hardest and so on would seem to make sense if we want economies to recover, they're not visible anywhere in the plans. And why? So we have to ask ourselves, right? Like, why is that? Why don't we see more on this issue? And I think part of it is, there's just a widespread and a fundamental misunderstanding of the structure of employment and the role of employment in recovery. And I think there are a few things going on here. So one is that policy ideas are framed in terms of either formal wage workers or sort of growth-oriented entrepreneurs, as if those are the only components of the employment structure. And yet we know own account workers, contributing family workers, other types of workers who are in informal employment arrangements are in fact a much larger proportion of the employment structure in a typical low-income or middle-income country. And this is really a function of who has more collective power and voice, and it reflects who is valued and who is not. Second thing is, I think, of course, we have to understand governments are under a lot of pressure, right, to draw up recovery plans. And so they tend to draw on the same types of tools that have been around for a long time. So one thing we see in the recovery plans is let's make a one-stop shop for micro enterprises. So, that's an idea that's been around for really a long time. So there's not a whole lot of creativity or kind of departure from the past in the plans. And then the third is, I think, the centrality of employment as a pathway out of poverty has been sort of lost in the fog of neoliberalism. We have to recognize employment is the way out of this mess we're in, but not just any employment for the sake of like presenting the number of jobs added or getting the unemployment rate down. The point is that employment needs to do more than just create earnings, right? So when it does that, when it brings more than just earnings and comes with some sense of, or some measure of institutional protection, then everyone is better off. So I should also say, to be sure, there are elements in some recovery plans that could theoretically eventually reach these workers that we're talking about. So skills training, as an example, could be helpful if it's designed thoughtfully and in partnership with worker organizations and in service of more and better quality employment. Reducing administrative barriers is another common one. It could be helpful if it's designed thoughtfully and in partnership with worker organizations and in service of this goal of more and better quality employment. Same with deepening local supply chains. It's another measure, could be helpful eventually, but we have to note also the issue of timescales in the recovery approaches in light of what we've heard from our panelists. We know that a common element of the early crisis response from the standpoint of government was social assistance in the form of mainly of cash grants, and where they reached the workers in our study, they were helpful. But as we've heard, for the most part, they've come and gone, or they've been very unevenly distributed. And the elements of the recovery plans that I just mentioned that could eventually be useful, skills training and things like that, would take quite some time to implement and see the benefit, at the same time that so many workers have really lost everything and are now at this point, almost 2 years on, having to reduce food to the bare minimum or one type. So this is also where the do no harm principle is so important. So at the very least, government approaches could not destroy workplaces or criminalize a livelihood activity that someone depends on. So that would, reducing the harm would bend the odds slightly less against workers whose employment arrangements don't give them any protection. But really what's needed is sort of a form of connection. It's a policy process where a worker in an informal employment arrangement can be seen as a human being on a human level with needs that go beyond a bare minimum of just earning. So this is someone who's doing everything she can to survive, and governments can't go on using the same old policy tools. They need a more fundamental reorientation of priorities. So what it would look like, I think, first find a way to provide for material needs, keeping this in mind that not only have earnings not recovered, but people have lost their assets. Find a way to support people's ability to work. Things like small grants for working capital, linking workers to vaccines, linking workers to markets for their products from the ground up in partnership with workers' organizations, those sorts of things. Find a way to enable better access to protection. So there are innovative ways to get to inclusive social insurance, for example. So there has to be willingness to experiment with things that haven't been done before, knowing that inclusive growth can't happen without investments in policies that connect more people to protections. And then find a way to make the legal and policy frameworks that are so far behind that reality of the global employment structure a little bit more adequate to today's employment picture. So planning with the prevalence of informal employment arrangements in mind, really at the center of plans moving forward. So that's a few reflections, I think, from the stepping back perspective. Thanks, Erin.
Thanks, Sally. And I mean, even just the sheer numbers of people that are in informal work, surely governments, if they don't know them already, if they're presented those numbers, I mean, it's just they're so large they just can't be ignored. And hopefully policymakers are starting to see this, So yeah, and I mean, thanks for all of that wisdom that you've just shared with us, and talking to us about really how we can build back better, and taking women's needs in particular into account, and seeing how women and men's needs over these period and continuation are not necessarily the same. And I've also really appreciated this you know, this whole thing about paperwork and administration and filling out forms and all of these kinds of things. I mean, we talk a lot about financial inclusion, right? But this is maybe like administrative inclusion. And surely with all of our tech and our artificial intelligence and all the things that are at our disposal now through smartphones that most people have, surely governments can find ways to make some of these processes more simpler for these informal workers, which may lead them to be either at least recognized and seen, so that they have a voice. I'm conscious of time. We do have time for Q&A and some comments that have been coming through. So I've got a few questions at the moment, but I encourage you to post any other questions you might have in the chat. Let me start with a question for Johnson. The question is, can we get some information about some safety measures that the waste pickers in Accra are practicing during the COVID-19 season? As I know their work requires close contact to the landfill site. So that's a question for you, Johnson. And I'll just ask one more question. Now this is to Josefa in New York. The question to you, Josefa, is, in your opinion, how can we increase bottles and cans for recycling in your center? How can we increase the number? So I'll start with those. Over to you, Johnson, for your reply.
Okay, thank you very much. So some of the safety measures that the landfill waste pickers are taking is now we have to enforce the laws that we have, our bylaws at the landfill, that each and everyone is supposed to be in his or her PPEs. So in terms of PPEs, we have introduce ourselves to the overall, the helmets, safety shoes, hand gloves, and nose masks. And this is what at the association level also we provide the hand gloves and the sanitizer and nose masks once a week at our own level. And also we made it possible water available to be at the site always, for all waste pickers to make sure they have washed their hands or washed themselves after work. And also we educate them how to isolate themselves from medical waste and other waste that comes to the landfill, and also not to work closely to the waste. They shouldn't get much contact with the waste. They have to make sure they keep a distance from the truck. After the truck dumps, then they can go in to salvage whatever they want to pick. And also, there are a lot of educations and trainings that we offer, but mostly you need to be in your PPEs before even entering the site. That is one of our key measures that we have taken in this season. Thank you. I don't know if I've answered your question.
Yes, thanks very much. So now I'll go over to Josefa in New York on how the question was about how we can increase the bottles and cans for recycling in your area. Over to you.
Muchas gracias. Thank you. Well, there are many ways to do this. What we have is the material that we get paid 5 cents for in New York, but there are many other materials that can be sent to us, like plastics, IC plastics. They're not being delivered to us. The water, the red line water products are not being sent to us, and they are selling this here. So all of that for us. We're not getting it, so we cannot sell it. We leave a lot of the material on the streets because we cannot store them in New York. So we need to leave them on the street, and we waste and we lose the opportunity to collect our 5 cents. Perhaps we could include more things like sauce bottles or wine bottles. We could work with that. We could recycle that, and that would be even more helpful for the environment. We could be more recycling more things like milk gallons or juice gallons or jugs. There are many other materials that we could be recycling, and we're not because we don't have the space for it. That's my opinion. Thank you.
Thank you, Josefa. So it's a combination of problems, actually. It's and I think what you're saying is that more things should be recycled, and that you need more space to actually store the things for recycling. I'm going to move now to, let me see now. I'm going to just actually read a comment that came out. So the comment is this, that on improving economic returns to members, many waste picker associations have explored the option to change their status to cooperatives. It's important to ensure that there's a good understanding of what the legal, financial, and reporting related requirements of setting up a cooperative are. I think that relates a little bit to what I was saying earlier about, you know, the paperwork, and are people getting trained in how to navigate through all of those financial reporting and legal requirements. So that's maybe just a question out to the group. And then I also have a question for Mike. Mike or Sally, so what policies are being promoted by multilateral organizations and by donors? And have these voices been helpful and supportive towards informal workers? Mike?
Thanks. I think I was just waiting to see who was going to go first. Yeah, thanks. You know, I think what has been helpful is that this is one of the first times that multilateral organizations have recognized the burden carried by informal workers. So at the outset of the crisis, there was a sense of optimism that at least the impact was recognized, as well as the size of the informal economy and the contribution it makes, particularly to economies in the global South. So particularly amongst ourselves, there was optimism that policies would then reflect the reality that was so clearly recognized as being the center of the crisis. And we thought perhaps that the direct threat to things like the Sustainable Development Goals that were clearly going to come out of a crisis that impacts 90% of workers in the global South would contribute to policy making that was a bit more creative and directed at the informal economy. But similar to the point Sally made about national recovery plans lacking in creativity, I think we've seen some of the same from multilateral organizations. At best, a lack of creativity and relying on some of the old tried and tested policy prescriptions. So for example, some of the main ones that seem to come out would be to improve human capital, which is something that's kind of been in the background for a long time and doesn't direct the immediate crisis we're facing, or the imbalance of power between workers and employers and workers and the state. Other policy prescriptions were also quite vague. For example, applying fiscal supports to the sectors that were most badly affected, but without any detail on how that would be. And then when that trickles down to the recovery level, we find that it deals mostly with formal micro enterprises rather than informal self-employed. So there was a real gap in how to be creative and direct resources to where they needed to be. I mean, one of the positive things that came out of the global level was that there was generally a recognition that this was not a time for austerity or fiscal conservatism, although that hasn't panned out either in many contexts. There's been a fallback on austerity, even though some of the multilateral organizations have been quite cautious about recommending fiscal conservatism in dealing with the crisis. And then at worst, there have been policies which seem actually quite harmful. A number of multilateral organizations have somehow come up with the solution that ending informality or punishing those in informal employment and forcing them out of informality and eradicating the informal economy would somehow be helpful. Sometimes without much detail in how this was to be done, but other times promoting incentives, reducing, for example, taxes for formal firms in the hopes that it would lure people into formality, while having punitive measures to basically create more obstacles for the informally self-employed. So on that spectrum, I think it's perhaps somewhat disappointing that it ranges from ineffective and a lack of creativity to, on the other end of the spectrum, somewhat harmful policies which seem to sort of bravely misunderstand the reality of informal work. And of course, the difficulty with answering your question is that multilateral organizations do approach those policy ideas at quite a broad level. And they do tend to acknowledge that policy should be sort of customized for individual context by country and the type of workers that are being affected. But then the problem then ends up being in the same way that Sally described, that the lack of creativity or the reliance on measures which previously didn't reach informal workers are then the policy levers that we use to address what I would describe as an urgent crisis for informal workers.
Thanks. I mean, it's like what Sally said, right? I mean, it's about the lack of creativity, and the answer to that is to actually speak to informal workers themselves, because I'm sure that they've got lots of creative ideas on solutions, and they're very clear on what it is, what kind of support they need. And so they need to be brought into the dialogue at the local, provincial, or state, or national levels. I think, multilateral organizations, as handy as they are many times, especially when they provide funding assistance, I think they're unable to understand the local context. Wonderful. Sally, did you have anything to add, or should I move on to the next question?
Well, yeah, thanks, Erin. I mean, Mackie's covered it very well. I guess just to say, getting back to that point about the employment arrangement, who is doing the arranging? That's really who is arranging for employment to be informal. That's where the crux of the matter is. So there are policy ideas that could be useful theoretically, and it really just depends on how they're implemented. So if you take something like, expanding social insurance, aiming for a universal system, but that has a contributory component, and the contributory component is not adequate to the reality that workers are in, so they can't access it, then it's not universal. So it's all about the how. It's not that all the policy ideas out there are bad, it's that the ones that could, in principle, make a difference will only do so in the long term and only do so in partnership. So while at the same time, those whose interest is in further pushing risk away down onto other parts of the economy are still doing what they're doing. So that's where the kind of the urgency for reprioritizing and rethinking, I think, comes from.
Super, thanks. I have now a question going back to the role of workers' organizations. So maybe I will ask this possibly to Shalu Ben if she's still on the call. The question is, what has been the role of informal worker organizations during the crisis in terms of providing relief and meeting medium or long-term needs to help with the recovery? I know, Shalu Ben, you mentioned some of the support that you yourself have been giving to some of your sisters, your colleagues, the other informal home-based workers. But maybe you could tell us a little bit more about how home-based worker organizations are helping during the crisis. And if Shalu Ben's not here, and maybe she's dropped off, I can ask that same question to Johnson, because you've got members, over 500 members. What are the things that your members have been able to do as a collective to assist in helping each individual waste picker?
Yeah. Thank you once again. So what we do is, in terms of the role the organization play, we made it in a way that the association or the organization should be the point of contact to the government in case the government want to talk to the people. And we also mobilize ourselves. We organize ourselves in a way to, in terms of sensitization and advocacy, we organize and also to train ourselves in a way that we can work together as a team. We can voice out in terms of highlighting our challenges and trends to other media personalities or other local government officials. So there are roles that the individuals also play through the organization. We are able to set up some committees that are to take care of some enforcement and also to approach the local government authorities in terms of the supports that we need, and also to represent the organization in many meetings and also on some board meetings in terms of the government call to help the waste pickers.
Wonderful. I thank you for that, Johnson. I'm going to give the floor to Shalini to add. Maybe you could add some insights on this.
Yeah, I could reflect a little bit on it from Delhi. So the worker organizations have really been the key support in this time, and that has been in several different ways. So Shalu spoke about some of them. She talked about ration and food provision in times of crisis when incomes were not there or there was lockdown and you could not go down. She also talked about vaccination, facilitating vaccination, building awareness about vaccination. The third thing also she mentioned, but was perhaps not so clear, was actually making work available. That when there is no work, how to facilitate the availability of work so that there is income in the family. And Seva, I know, has been doing that for home-based workers. The fourth thing that we saw in Delhi, and it's an interesting sort of example to put forward, is that when even in the relief provision in Delhi, there was a committee which was set up by the government of Delhi, including many NGOs, which helped identify the most vulnerable of the groups. And they did it in a very innovative way. That's one way. The second was that we have several instances of how documentation and the challenges associated with documentations not being there for migrants, the whole process of documenting or documents not being there for street vendors to access belief, how that is facilitated by the presence of a workers' organization. So in Delhi, they were able to use Aadhaar, which is the the identity, all India identity card, but not situated in geographically in Delhi, but they were able to advocate to issue e-coupons for issuing of food grants. So that was then one big arrangement. The second, for instance, what I mentioned about having proxies for identifying workers, that we have seen in several instances on, if there is a letter of recommendation, say by the municipality about a street vendor sitting there, or if a vendor organization or a worker organization is ready to identify and give a certificate that this is a vendor. So those things. But more than anything else, I think at a macro level, what workers' organizations have been able to do is to highlight the impact on the workers at the sectoral level, at the city level, at the national level, and with varying degree of success. But bringing the voices of the workers, whether it is in planning processes, whether it is in design of some of the schemes. And I do want to share with you that in India, we have this process which is registering of informal sector workers, which is ongoing at the moment. And it's a government scheme where the workers are being registered. But if you were to see it on the ground, you would think it is a worker organization or a civil society thing. So the government has just announced and then just left. Now it's the civil society organizations of building awareness, facilitating linkages, making sure all the documents that are required are there. So that the last mile delivery of some of these well-intentioned schemes depends so much on worker organizations and worker groups, collectives, workers' voices. When they come together, they are able to demand more, access better, I think.
Thank you, Shalini. Yeah, absolutely, fantastic. And I know some of the other work, some other research that IDRC has done on home-based worker organizations has shown as well that they're just so much better off, those that are actually in some kind of organization. So fantastic to hear more about it. Sadly, we've come to the end of our time. Here it is already. We've spent this wonderful time together, and I really wanted just to thank the panelists, thank the participants, and the event organizers at WIEGO, and the city level reports will be available, as we've said, in the coming months. And we'll touch base with all the participants to share the links to all the material that was shared in the chat. So I think that'll be coming to you via email. And I just want to wish you all a wonderful evening, afternoon, wherever you are, and stay safe. And thank you so much. Really, really appreciate it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Erin. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.